Hope everyone's having a wonderful day. This is our third part to our GSAP series. What we're going to create is this lovely testimonial slider. The purpose of the slider is to have our reviews or testimonials being displayed. If we click on the left arrow, it will just go backwards, and so it's kind of in this constant loop between these three images. We are using GSAP for this project and also building it out in React.js. First thing I want to do is to go ahead and break down the project just so that we have a better understanding moving forward. I am using SASS, so to install SASS, just go ahead and install it as a dependency, and I am using GSAP, so just do the same with that. I have an assets folder which contains the three images and the arrow left and arrow right SVG. And if you want to go ahead and follow us, don't forget to just download the project files in the description. If you can go ahead and leave a like, that will truly help me out, and don't forget to subscribe. Now let's go ahead and look at our app.js. We are importing GSAP and using three different hooks, the useState, useRef, and useEffect, importing our left arrow and right arrow. We are also using reset CSS, so that is optional if you want to do that, and finally importing our app.sass. We do have a testimonials array, and all it is just a name, title, image, and quote. This is the three different slides that we'll be displaying. And then we do have our app components. I am not creating any additional components. I'm just writing all the code in app.js just for the sake of this project. But we are using our useRef for an image list and the testimonials list. I do have a variable setting the image width to a fixed 340 pixels. That way when we do math in the future for the animations, we don't necessarily need to always remember the 340. I am also using a state, so I'm keeping track of which slide is currently active. So I have is active 1, 2, and 3. The project starts out with the first slide being active, so this is set to true, and the other slides are false. Our useEffect just sets the initial slide to an opacity of 1 so that it's visible. And then finally down here we have our custom functions. So I'll just go ahead and write custom functions. And we have 5 different functions which represent certain animations. So we have slide left, slide right, scale, and fade out and fade in. Fade out and fade in represents our content, and then the slide left, slide right, and scale is our image. So when we select the next arrow, our content right here fades out and fades back in. And if you look at the image, what happens is that there's a scale, and so it also moves to the left. And if we select the left arrow, it scales and moves to the right. There are predefined parameters, so we have index, duration, and multiplied. For our slide left and right functions, we have 3 parameters: an index parameter, a duration, and a multiplied parameter. Multiplied parameter is already default to 1 if it isn't defined in the arguments below. And the index represents which slide we're currently on. So when we use our array, we're using 0, 1, 2. It isn't 1, 2, 3. So just defining which slide it is, the very first slide is 0, the second slide is 1, and the third slide is 2. So the index represents the position or the slide. The duration is duration. It's usually 1 in our case. In the scale, fade out, and fade in, we aren't using a multiplied parameter, so we're just using duration and index. Coming down to our next functions, we have next slide and previous slide. And so what happens is when next slide is ran, and it is ran every time we hit the next slide, and then the previous slide function is ran every time we hit the previous arrow. What it does is it checks which current slide is active. And so if the first slide is active, it'll run these certain functions. If the second slide is active, it'll run these other functions. And if the third slide, or in this case, second slide, is active, it'll run these functions. Previous slide does the same thing, but it's a little different because you're going backwards, so it's just kind of the opposite. And then finally, scrolling down, we do have our JSX, and we are using that dynamic content that we're pulling in from the testimonials data. The SASS file is just the SASS file with styles, and that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and actually code this out. Now that we're ready to code it out, all I have is testimonials data, pulling in reset CSS and app.scss, and then we just have 2 divs of the testimonial section and testimonials container. Our app.sass is completely empty, and let me bump this up. Great, so I'm gonna go ahead and write the JSX code out. So the very first thing that I need to do is create a div for our arrows, and we can just add a span, and then the image and our image source is going to be left arrow, and we can always just add an alt tag of left arrow. The class name for our arrows is going to be in arrows, and then we're going to specify arrows left. So we're getting an issue here because left arrow is not defined, and to pull in your arrows, all you need to do is just import, and you could name it whatever you want. We'll say left arrow from, and if we jump into our assets folder, we can then find arrow-left.svg. And let's go ahead and do the same for the right arrow. So just copy and paste that in and rename this to right arrow. Great, now we could do the same thing with arrow left to make our arrow right. And so with arrows, just go ahead and change anything that says left to right. That's perfect. Now we need to create our intersection. So we're going to split up the arrow left and arrow right. And in between those items, just go ahead and create a div of class name inner. And inside our inner div, what we want to do is create that image and the content. So we are using Flexbox heavily in this project. The very first div you want to create is a class name of t-image, and t is just representing testimonials. I just don't want to write that out. So t-image, and inside t-image we'll create an unordered list, and our very first list item is going to have an image inside. I hate when this happens. We need to soft close our images. And the source of our image is going to be set to testimonials. And we're going to use a bracket to access our very first object. So adding 0 will access that first object. And once we're in that object, we can then access our image property. So just adding a dot image, we'll pull in the first image, which is Julia Cameron's image. We can then just add an alt tag. And so our alt tag can also just be testimonials, the first object, and then the name property. And if you're pushing this live, you can get the name property, and so it'll say Julia Cameron, and then you could add just that plus sign and then just type in image, so it'll be like Julia Cameron image. But just for now, we'll use alt as Julia Cameron. Go ahead and copy this 2 more times and save that, and then just change 0 to 1 and 0 to 2, and then for the name, just do the same here. Go ahead and save that. And if we preview our project so far, we have the left arrow, we have the first image, second image, third image, and then we have another left arrow, which we didn't change arrow-left on the very top, so we want to say arrow-right, and that will switch. So we have the right arrow, all 3 images pulled, and then the left arrow. Okay, so this is good, we're making progress. Next, we want to go outside of our t-image div, and we can create another div with the class name t-content. And inside the t-content, we'll go ahead and create another unordered list and create a list item. And finally, inside that list item, we'll create a div, which will have the class name of content-inner, which represents the inner part or the inside of our content, or sorry, the inside of our list. So the very first thing what we're going to do is add a p tag, and this p tag will have a class name of quote. So this p tag will represent our quote. Go ahead and drop an h3 with the class name, which will represent our person's name. And then finally, the h4 will represent the title. So adding a class name of title will give us the title. Now to pull in that dynamic data, we're going to go ahead and add curly brackets to both these items, and then just do testimonials. We want to get the very first object and then just pull in the properties that we want to get. So the quote property will have a dot quote, the name property will have a dot name, and the title property will have a dot title. Go ahead and save that, and if we preview our project, we should get, it's all good. I was amazed at the quality of the design. We've seen amazing results already. Julia Cameron, creative director at Visa. That's pulling in Julia Cameron's information. Now we need to get the second person and the third person's information in. And to do that, just go ahead and copy the list item, paste that in once and paste it in twice, and then change the zeros to 1, 1, 1, and then on the second section, change the zeros to 2, 2, oh, not 3. 2, and then another 2. Go ahead and save that, and then we should pull in the other 3 people's information. Now that's our JSX complete. What we could go ahead and do is work on our SASS, and we should just have this completely styled after this part. Now, when I always work with styles, what I like to do is just split these 2. If I can get them split into halves, how do I do that? Okay, split them up into halves, and I just write sort of the skeleton or the schema and nest every single class correspondingly. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then the next screen, everything should be nested, and we should write our styles. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and close this out, and actually we can open it, but just leave it in the tabs. So I do have our CSS or SASS nested skeleton in here. And if you want to pause this, go ahead and copy this. You can do so. One thing I do want to mention is I do have a text and a secondary color. I might add additional variables for colors, and you can just follow me there. And then finally, for the HTML body, I am using a font type or a font family of Avenir. So if you don't have that, you can download it if you want, or you could use an alternative font. Now, first things first, in all projects, I like to just define the section. So our section is going to have a height of 100 VH, and what VH represents is a viewport height. So it'll grab the viewport and it'll set the height to 100%, or completely add it to 100% of the height of whatever viewport you're viewing it from. This isn't really ideal when working on a full-scale project or a production project, just because sometimes when you change the viewport height in the browser, it will just mess things up. But in this case, since we are working on one section, I always like to set my height to a viewport height of 100. Next, we are using Flexbox, so go ahead and say display flex, justify content to center, and align the items, to center. This will get everything nicely centered. Next, for the testimonials container, I am setting a width of 1280 pixels and a min width of 1280 pixels. The height is going to be set to 600 pixels along with the position, and the position is relative. If you don't know what position relative versus position absolute is, I do recommend you should look into that. It's very basic, but it's extremely important to know and understand when to use relative and when to use absolute. Next, for our arrows is going to have an absolute position. So for position, go ahead and set that to absolute. Let's see, display flex, a width of 100 pixels. The alignment is going to be align items center, and the justify content is also going to be center. Finally, for bottom, we're going to set bottom to 0 and top to 0. This allows it to center our items as well. And then finally, for our cursor, we do want to add a cursor pointer, as well as adding a bordered radius to 8 pixels. And for now, we can use a transition, and we can set the transition to 0.3 s or 0.3 seconds, and set the easing to ease in, ease out. Now, I did add a and.right, and what this means is if it has the arrow class and also have the right class, we want it to do something else. So we want to change the right to 0, which will push our right arrow to the far right of the screen. If we save that and look at our project, we do see our right arrow here and our left arrow here. And if we change the background, just so we could see how it's represented, if we change the background to pink, we can see that the container itself is that 1280 by 600 pixels. And then using that relative position, we're able to set the boundaries of where we want our arrows. And so we want our arrows within that 1280 600 container, and then we want them on the far left and far right. So if we hover up here, we still are able to click our arrows. If we hover down here, we're still able to click our arrows. Let's go ahead and remove the background pink off that. Next, we want to jump into our .inner, which gets into the meat of our content and image. Using Flexbox, go ahead and write display flex. We want to justify the content to center, align our items to center, and also set the height of 600 pixels, which is equivalent to our container. The t-image is going to have a width of 500 pixels, and the height is going to have a height of 600 pixels, similar to our inner and our container. Using Flexbox again, we want to use display flex and just justify the content to center, and also align our items to center. If we save that and take a look at what happened, we sectioned our images to the left and the content to the right, but now we need to do some additional changes because it doesn't look good at all, but we're getting there. We are going to use our trusty display flex, and if we save this, it will move them horizontal, but we still have work to do. So set the position to absolute, and also change the overflow to hidden. This will cut off any section outside of the defined widths and height. And so our defined widths and height are going to be a height of 460 pixels and a width of 340 pixels. We can also go ahead and drop a box shadow. So to add a box shadow, go ahead and use box shadow and then define the x-axis, which is 0, the y-axis, the blur, which is going to be 40 pixels, and then RGBA. And the RGBA is going to be 0, 0, 10, and finally for alpha or opacity, that's going to be 2.25. Save that. And there is something wrong. We do not have a close bracket, not a close bracket, sorry, but this thing, I forgot its name. It's so embarrassing. But if we save that, we can see we created our dimensions in sort of this little mask layer. That's what the overflow hidden does. It kind of just cuts everything outside of it, but nothing is sized correctly. So in our list item, we also want to define the widths as our unordered list. So the width and height is also going to be 460 and 340 pixels. And finally, inside our image, it's going to have the same dimensions as our list item and our unordered list items. Saving that, we can see we have a perfect fit into our box. Finally, we can adjust our content. So in t-content, we'll specify our width of the content to 500 pixels and the height to 600 pixels. Using our trusty display flex, we want to align the items to the center. And for our unordered list, we also want to use an absolute position. Changing the overflow to hidden, similar to our T image. We also want to set the width to 500 pixels as well. And for the height of our unordered list, we're going to make it 400 pixels. Our list item is going to have the same dimensions as our unordered list, so setting the width and the height to 500 and 400 pixels. One thing I do want to mention, if you're not using Reset CSS, usually list items come with a styled list item and unordered lists come with certain padding or margin, but using Reset CSS, that gets rid of it. So that's why I do like it, because I don't have to write additional CSS code here. Now our color is going to be the text variable color, and we're also using display, not inline. We're using display flex, aligning the items to center, and then we want to set the positioning to not relative but absolute, and change the opacity to 0 for our list items. We only want our active item to be visible. This will hide every list item, and earlier I did mention that use effect, and what our use effect is going to do is set our first list item to an opacity of 1. Now our content inner is going to have a width of 500 pixels. And finally, bear with me here, we're almost done. For the quote section, we're going to have a font size of 26 pixels, a letter spacing of 0.88 pixels, so 0.88 pixels, and a line height of 40 pixels. Add a font weight of 700, and finally a margin bottom of 16 pixels. For our name, we can copy letter spacing just so we could paste it in the name class and the title class. But for the name class, the font size is different. So font size of 18 pixels. Our line height for the .name class is also different from the quote. So the line height is going to have a 28 pixels line height, and the color is going to be set to secondary. And the font weight is just shy of 700. So we're going to say 600, which represents semi-bold. Our title will also be extremely similar to our .name class, so if we just copy everything and paste it in, but we'll go ahead and change the font weight to regular, and you could just change it by just removing it, and that will set it to 400 or regular. Now if we view our project, we can see that it looks right, we're just missing that content section. And that is because the opacity is set to 0. If we set the opacity to 1, it will look really jabbered up and not good. So that is an issue we need to fix. To quickly just fix this issue in SASS rather than using the useEffect hook, we can just say add the ampersand and just type in nth child of 1, set the opacity to 1. This will only call our first child, which is the very first list item, and change the opacity to 1, which will make it show here. Now we are missing several things. We are missing that pseudo element of a blue circle, and we are missing a gray rectangle just to add some texture to the background. And we also need to add sort of that underlying text that we had that represented key details or important information in our quote. So I think what I want to do first is add that gray background or that gray texture. And to do that, we need to scroll all the way up to our testimonials section. We need to add an after pseudo element. Add the content to an empty string and set the position to an absolute position, adding a width of 900 pixels and a height of 550 pixels, changing the background to F2, not the $, but F2, F2, F6. And we also need to set the right to 0, bottom to 0. And let's go ahead and change the opacity to 0.8. Save that, and we can see that it's in the right position, but it sort of lays on top of everything else, and we don't want it to do that. What we could do is use a z-index and set this to -10. This will push it to the far back. I also wanted to add a box shadow when I hover over the arrows. So since we're up here already, let's do that. We can add an ampersand of hover and just throw on a box shadow, making the x-axis 0 pixels, the y-axis 0 pixels, and RGBA of 0, 0, 80, and then the alpha being 0.05. Saving that, and we already have a nice ease effect with the transition 0.3 ease in, ease out. So now if we hover on the arrows, nothing seems to happen. That's because we didn't define the blur radius. And to define that, all you need to do is the third item here, instead of the first two, X, Y, the blur represents 40. I think 30 is actually better. So now when we hover, it's very subtle, but you could kind of see it. It's just an indicator letting you know that you can actually click on the arrows from far up here or far down here. Now I also want to add that blue circle that was over here, and that's also using an after pseudo element. So if we go down to our t-image, we can attach a pseudo element of after, and it will be the very same thing that we wrote up top. So content is set to an empty string, and the position is set to absolute. The width and height are the same of 200 pixels. The background color is a blue color, so we'll just make one up. 3F56DA. I think that's a good one. And set the left to -150 pixels. We'll just stick with 150 pixels, and the top of 0. And then don't forget to add a border radius of 100% so that we can make it completely round. And so that's completely off. I want to see, what if we change the left to -10 pixels? That brings it in more. What if we actually get rid of the negative and then say 140? Okay, so that layers it on top, which is good, but we also need to change the z-index. And to add that, what you want to do is go ahead and set the z-index to -9. Having saved that project, what we should end up with is a pretty close resemblance to what our final project would look like. We have the blue circle behind our image. Finally, what we could do is go ahead and add another pseudo element to have sort of that underline effect on all our items. And let's actually do that now instead of wait towards the end. So in our list items within the t-content, the first child, we can go ahead and leave opacity 1, but we need to come back and remove this. So let's just create a comment saying remove later. We need to create a after pseudo element within our first child. So like always, we want to set the content to an empty string, the position to absolute, the height can be 12 pixels, width can be set to 310 pixels. The background, we want a background color of text, so we can just say text there. And the opacity, we'll drop that down to 0.3, followed by a left of 0 and a top of 200 pixels. Go ahead and save that and let's see what we end up with. We can see it's aligned perfectly with our last line, but we don't necessarily want that. We want it to be just a bit under, so maybe 206 top. I think that's good. It's sort of that midway point. I'm gonna go ahead and create the nth child for the second and third one. If you wanna figure out how to do that, what you can just do is just copy this over and then change the nth child to 2 and leave the opacity as 1 here, but set the opacity to 0 on the first one, just so that we could see what our second child looks like, our second list item looks like. So we could see what works for our first pseudo element doesn't work for our second one, so we need to just adjust that. We can change the width of our second one to 148 pixels, and the left is going to be set to 48 pixels, followed by the top of 126 pixels. Saving that, we can highlight the term highlight the term rebranding. Let's go ahead and do that one more time and have it number 3, opacity 1, change the opacity to the second one to 0 for now. And the width is what's going to change, so 280 pixels. And the left is going to be 144 and the top is 166. Save that and we can see a complete redesign is what's highlighted. Now we can remove opacity 1 for this third child and for the second one, and then just change it back to 1 so that we can always have the quote section visible. Now I think this is pretty much it for the UI. We can go ahead and start working with the GSAP and JavaScript to create the animation.